this afternoon, me glad me got one special guest belong me where me start belong Vanuatu the Port Vila this time. Everyone Chinese American citizen, and Mr. Visiting country belong me. More, everyone very interesting man. Go all part long world finish long Africa, and especially the developing countries. Is that look. One man where he write them over 170 books. Look long science more. Visionary man. Look long what start happen on life no future. Make him plan the story and round. When finish, make place look state of lifestyle being middle of Vanuatu. More kind place here. It's a story on anything. You talk about science. You talk about politics. You talk about health. You talk about climate change. Bikola man Bohemia. One special man where he talk, one man where he walk him one, and he got unique look on him one the life. More me got by the time story with him and we find him say him one interesting man where me bring him come show bring me to the table talk about some story where he relate long when him not me story and program to me is all about. And welcome to our show, Dr. Peter Baofu, welcome to the show.
Okay, thank you for inviting me.
I was just saying you're a very interesting person, and having written over 170 books and all about life, and I'm so interested in the humanitarian part of the story, where we talk about the rights of different peoples of all countries, and I listen to you. And I watched some of your YouTube interviews, and you've been to Africa several times, several years, many years, for many years, you're in and out of Africa. And I think you are very well versed on countries that have background like us in Vanuatu. We were once colonized by Europeans, and today we're independent, and we are struggling to establish an economic self-reliant society, and I'm sure you are very well versed on the realities of life in other parts of Africa and other developing countries, and you have so much to share with us. How can we learn from your stories? So far, since your arrival here in Vanuatu, I understand you've met several people, and especially people who are impacted by this climate change phenomenon, and farmers and all those different people in town or in the country. But I want to focus mostly on one particular aspect of your visionary that reflects on the purpose of this program. This program was created in 2007 to remind the Vanuatu people of their independence, what it's meant to be independent, what are the duties and responsibilities of the new citizens of this new republic, and what are the challenges that they face in terms of developing their own policies in contrast to existing or ongoing colonial-based systems that continue to impact on the decisions on the policies that we make. And I am sure that you have studied Vanuatu before you come here. Before coming here, can you tell us a little bit of the way you see Vanuatu going at this point in time?
That is a very important but also very interesting question. I was interviewed a few days ago about this before on a different topic. But my answer to your question over here is that I can see that there must be two sides of the conversation, not just one side. I think that there is one side which is the internal side, and the other side is the external side. I think that many of the problems that I have observed in Vanuatu, many of them can be traced back to the mindset and the behaviors of the local people. But on the other side of the same equation is that quite a number of the problems are also a legacy of external interventions and powers. So to resolve this problem in the longer term, I think that you have to look into both sides of the equation. And if you only focus on one side and blaming the other side, or blaming one side and focusing or favoring the other side, that is only one side of the solution, and that's not going to work.
And yeah, you like I said earlier that you've been to several countries already, and I think there are some lessons learned that we from Vanuatu can pick from those countries. And you mentioned now about blaming. You should avoid blaming, but rather learning from the experience that we had. Because yeah, we have a legacy of the colonial mindset that's still there. We speak in English now. We're talking in English. This is a foreign language, but this is what we have adopted and we've accepted in our constitution that it is one of the 3 official languages of our country. But given the humanitarian side of the coin, looking at sovereignty of the sovereign people, we in Vanuatu, our first Prime Minister made a statement that we are independent, but we are not, Vanuatu is not free until other colonized countries are free. What is your view on colonization?
That view is not new, by the way. This has been repeated many times in the last few decades around the world, especially by those in underdeveloped countries. You go to Africa, you will see that many of the African leaders have been talking about this too. It's not new, even in the Middle East. Even if you go to Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, and people are also become more and more aware that all these fightings, for example, that is a very serious social and economic and cultural cost on development. So when you have the colonial legacy and now you become independence, but independence in word only, nominal independence, but in reality, if you look at life surrounding you, even here in Vanuatu, and you can see that many of the colonial legacy is still there. Just as you said, just as I have mentioned in my previous interview last week, is that how come people here are speaking English? I mean, why do you not speak your own local language? Even Burma, for example, is a mixture of
Islam.
Yeah, so that is more or less like also a colonized language too. How come you do not use your own language? For example, the churches over here, there's Christian religion, and they celebrate, they talk about God. How come you don't have your own God? How come your God is a imported colonial God, which has been imposed on you?
Well, we come to well, I think you explained last time, asking him about look how you start and about how all thinking we start the colonial time you start the mindset you and then you come kasan titi mo ini look say instead of you blame him one side or the other you start long metal but you must look good how now you make a way you move forward and his advice also now long colonization issues we talk about and anyone long for a long time call where anyone humanitarian something where hemi ongoing and look say you need to people now people only mass make a mind about this straight. Now I'm just thinking of Vanuatu. We were discussing earlier on about in this topic that we discuss and I bring you in that there is a policy that's after independence the government had a policy in place saying our economic growth will be driven by the private sector. Now when we look after 40 years looking back at the private sector are mostly either those foreigners who have stayed on or who have come in to do business here. And so the private sector is owned by other people and not the indigenous, or the indigenous are not given equal opportunity to participate in the private sector. The systems that are in place are more like anti them. It's the bar that is set up there is too high for them. One of the guests who sat here in this program said, Vanuatu people are resource rich but financially poor. Those in the private sector, the foreigners, are resource poor but are financially rich. And then he said, if we don't have an equal term, we will soon give opportunity to those who are financially rich to take over those who are resource rich today. In the future, there will be resource poor and financially poor as well. So it is a frightening view. Like people, the Vanuatu should be scared about this view, and that's why we're calling on the government to review this so-called private sector-led growth and to make provisions to help Vanuatu to be able to perform on equal terms with those who are coming with, mostly those who are coming to do business here, big representing multi-million-dollar companies. In your view, how can we balance the imbalance that we have today in Vanuatu?
This is a moral question. This is a question of business equity. This is a question of business fairness. So to achieve that is the same issue which has confronted a lot of African countries, for example, that I have visited, and also many other countries too. You have a lot of foreign businesses come to a local community and they tend to dominate. But I think that is a double-edged sword. It depends on how you approach that. It's a question of balancing. I think that the government can come in and do some help. It's not just a question for the private sector to handle. I think the government also has a role. Now the question now is based on which vision, based on which ideology. So if you want to have a leftist ideology, a leftist vision, then you may ask the government to come in and do a lot and try to force the foreign investment people to yield too much to you. But I think that can be self-destructive too if you push too far, because you will scare away a lot of foreign investors. They don't come to you anymore because now you are asking A, B, C, and D, you are asking too much. In fact, that's exactly what a lot of governments have been trying to balance out. But I do think that in the case of Vanuatu, the government can do more. But it also depends on the ideology and the vision that you use to resolve the issue, because this problem cannot be resolved out of the blue. It depends on which ideology and vision that you have in mind. So what I have heard so far is from people who tend to be very leftist when they complain about this problem. I understand their concern. I may be concerned too that their solution may be too radical. But on the other hand, if you do not do much of anything, then they can also take advantage of you too. So I think that there's a question of balancing. Again, and it depends on an ideology that you have. I do have some vision. And
so this ideology must be homegrown, based on experience or whatever.
I do think the homegrown is a very important one, but it doesn't mean that we don't learn from others. Because we're in the age of globalization now, almost every product that you make, the chances, many of the components are from different countries, like the radio and the TV, the screen and the hardware that you have over here. If you open that up, if you look inside the chances, many of the components are from different countries. So it's the same thing about the ideology. Now the homegrown ideology is very difficult for you to just.
So this is what you mean. I mean, this is humanity. I mean, humanity does not discriminate. Everybody blend together, But I think the way you're saying now, I'm seeing like there are people who manipulate others, and that's not. This is not in the line of humanity. But we need people who are looking for a way forward to blend what you have. For example, Chinese government or the Chinese way today, they're a very interesting country to observe and to follow. Like these so-called developed countries have been up there ever since like when in my school days. But today we're talking about the China that have come since you're a Chinese American and you're descent Chinese. Can you just share a little bit of how the Chinese did it?
I'm an Asian American. I don't call myself a Chinese American because nowadays Asian Americans want to unite as a political force. But if you say that I'm Chinese American, you are Japanese American, or you are Vietnamese American, you are Korean American, so you are divided.
Yes.
And that is my, so I do not want to talk like you are talking. So I would like to identify myself as an Asian American.
Yes.
But in terms of the relationship between the Chinese model that you are talking about and Vanuatu development, I do think that each country can learn from others, but in the end, you are from Vanuatu and they are from China. And any Chinese cannot become more, let's say, a Westerner any more than a Westerner can become Chinese. That's not realistic, the same logic. I do think that people in Vanuatu can learn from China, but they cannot become Chinese. And China can learn from Vanuatu too, but they cannot become like, how do you call it now? A Nai Vanuatu? Ni Vanuatu. Okay, fine. So in that sense, you can learn from them. Now, what makes China so interesting nowadays and major concern is because in the last few hundred years, if you look at many of those major powers which have controlled global politics, many of them are European or countries with European descent. They are white people mostly. Okay, and nowadays, really for the first time, we can talk about Japan too. Back in the early 20th century, but they are tiny by comparison with the giant of China nowadays. So for the first time in the last few hundred years, all of a sudden we have a new global order emerging, which is not really Western, which is really Asian. Japan tried to do that too, but Japan was too small. It was not that important internationally. But by comparison, by contrast now, in my publication, I predict a long time ago, more than 20 years ago, that China and together with India too will emerge and to regain their former prominence in international politics. If you look into human history for several thousand of years, before the rise of the modern West, it was India and China which dominated the international economic arena, for example. The global civilizational centers, the heavyweights, they were in East Asia and South Asia, for example. Not even the Roman Empire could compare with that. But now this has been changing. That's why we have such a rivalry and major concern in international mass media. Used to be dominated by Western mass media. So that is this kind of concern. But can they learn something from it? Yes, I do. This is the same question that people have been asked now in Africa. Should Africa learn from China any more than can Vanuatu learn from China? I say yes, of course. But remember, at the end of the day, you are you, they are they. So the blending cannot be complete. It's still homegrown, but you can learn from it.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Dr. Peter. We'll be back. I'm going to come back after a short commercial break. The line is open 27107. Suppose you start listening and you want them ask him any question or Professor Wistat, telephone number 27107. I'm going to come back after the show. Yes, welcome back to our Talk Back Show, bringing me along Capital FM 107, Vanuatu Today. Moses Stevens from Time to you inside our studio in downtown Port Vila, where you make a very special and interesting guest of belonging to Professor Peter Baofu, where anyone Asian American, where me Mr. Listening to me more. Everyone where we got one visionary, where we call him one man, where we got developing one vision, more vision about humanity, more specifically harem. That's him one talk at the beginning and last part of the talk about learning. I'm interested in life. You spoke about learning from each other and blending, and then you said, but life will never be complete. And I agree with you on that because they say life goes on, evolution continues on, and I think we need to let our people understand that this leftist and rightist ideas, ideologies primitive. As far as I'm concerned, colonization is primitive, but humanity is the way. I think the new platform that people should, exploit and find where we can all blend together. We can all. You're living in America. You're an Asian American, but you've been living in Africa. Now you're around Oceania. Now we are part of a global family, but there are some lines that we need to respect. It's like running a home. I come to your home. I can't just walk into your bedroom. I need to respect some lines there. I come and see you, and we sit and talk in a living room or in the porch out there, or under a tree, and we converse about whatever we want to talk about. But yeah, I just wanted to give you a vision on life. How can we make this world a better place with all the resources, with all the things that we have around us? Like we are growing, but we need ideas from our former colonial masters. Still, we need ideas from new friends like in China, in other parts of the world, to build a house. Not just to listen to other people telling us what to do all the time. Otherwise, we'll become under their rule again. So, can you just talk about life, how you see life should be, given the realities? You're here, you're free, you're walking around town here, you're enjoying life, talking to different people. Just want you to share your views on your vision on what future do you see should be in the world that we live in.
Yeah, as a start, it's true that I also lived in Africa for some years, but I have been in more than 125 different countries, which means that I have been in all regions of the world. So I don't just live in Africa, I also live in Europe, in the Middle East, in Latin America, in South Asia, in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, in many other places. So based on my observation and also on my master publications, humanity is not homogeneous. In fact, one of the principles that I proposed in my publications is what I call the asymmetry principle, which is to say that if anything which is symmetry, there's also asymmetry. What I'm trying to say is that when you use that to understand international affairs, yes, you can talk about humanity, but they are not equal. They are not symmetric. In some ways they are, but in many other ways they are not. So when you talk about homegrown ideology or vision, whatever you have, yes, of course, you have to understand who you are, what you want, what you can do, and all that. But remember, in the end, you are not equal with others on Earth, and that's how we live on this planet Earth. So you have to know how to cope with those outside powers, which are more powerful and more influential than you are. So when we talk about international relations in terms of humanity, for example, yes, we can understand humanity in that sense, but remember, humanity is not an empty word. It's a laden word with different powers, interests, and struggles. So yes, you can learn from it, but in the end, it cannot be a goal of humanity in a very homogeneous way. There's competing versions, competing ideology. So secondly, I do think that a good way to start to answer your question is to ask the local people over here and say, what exactly is the thing which can unite all of you together as a vision, as an ideology? This is something that I spoke about in the previous interview last week here. And that ideology and vision is lacking. In fact, it's the same problem in Africa too. But I saw one of the most urgent agenda for many of these people to do is to come up with their own homegrown vision and ideology. Yes, you can always borrow from the outside. You have to learn from others, especially those which are much more powerful and much more advanced than you are. So learn from them, but in the end, you cannot borrow or import completely what they have, and because you are not they, and they are not you. For example, by analogy, it's very naive. Now, the West has been pressure in China for several decades now, do this, do that, and enforce them to do this, and they think that in the end the Chinese will become a Westerner. That's an illusion. Now they wake up to the new reality that China is China. Globalization doesn't mean that Westernization. Modernization doesn't mean that everyone should behave like a white, like a Westerner. You have your own values, you have your own belief. You can learn from others. In the end, we have to respect that other people cannot behave always like a white man or a white woman or a Westerner. And you also
Or
cannot,
vice versa.
and vice versa. The
Yes.
Chinese, however powerful they are, Japanese cannot expect that people in the West will behave like the Chinese. And Japanese, an illusion. They are what they are. They are Europeans, they are Westerners, they have their own values. You have to respect their values. Yes, you can learn from each other. No, for sure, there's no problem. By the same logic, people in Vanuatu can learn from others, but in the end, you need your own ideology and your own vision. But what is that? That is lacking here. So one of the most urgent problems facing Vanuatu is that you need to come up with that kind of vision. I'm sure that people, sooner or later, there are some people here in Vanuatu, some of them are historical shakers. They will come up, they are very extraordinary person. They will come up with a new vision and say, this is what we stand for as a people. Not my party versus your party, my ethnic group versus your ethnic group, my island versus your island, my community versus your community. All of us in this country, we unify by that vision to liberate ourselves from this A, B, C, and D. You need to work out the content. I give you the vision, the idea, but you have to work it out. I'm sure that someone in the future will come up and work this out, and it's one of the most urgent agenda.
No, thank you very much for saying that. And Mr. Talenomo said, make him say, Yumi stand up, Yumi, but Yumi also connect with those around us. So, one very important talk big man by me, Talen, you will start listening come. Number 27107, suppose you got any question, ask him or comment with me, and make him come. Professor, very interesting indeed, and one of my topics that I discussed in this program was the lack of thinking. The lack of thinking in the country, that we don't have thinkers, serious thinkers in our country. We just go along with whatever comes, and that's where the mindset of our past legacy of colonialism remains, and then we can advantage ourselves in so many ways. But I think you have touched on a very important point that, in fact, we have touched on. We need visionaries. We need those. We need to be thinking. Don't just sit there and accept whatever comes, but sit down and think over things. Think through government policies, community relations, and personal relationships. Our values, are they standing or are they being eroded by? Now we have mobile phones. Before we only have radios that we can listen to Radio Australia, BBC, Radio France. Now we have satellite, we can connect to Chinese radio stations, Japanese or whatever. And now with the arrival of internet, our kids have access to internet in their hands with the smartphones now. And all these things here are coming, catching up on us so fast. And then the lack of thinking and the lack of visioning is endangering ourselves. How do you see this? We are not developing our own concepts, ideas, and we are being, overtaken by these ideologies that's coming via internet.
Again, this problem is not unique to Vanuatu, and I have been in more than 120-something countries that I told you. In many of the underdeveloped countries that I have been in Africa, Latin America, Asia, and all that, in Eastern Europe and all that, it's the same phenomena. When you are underdeveloped, in one way or the other, you have some inferiority complex. You understand it. You look down on yourself. You look up on those who are the colonial powers, the major powers. Whatever they do, you copy. Because they colonized you before, or they are much more powerful than you are, and you are much weaker than they are. So you look you look up toward them as a copycat, so to speak. Now, the problem is that that also makes you divided over time, because you will not be able to learn from yourself and say to yourself, this is what I want, this is what I am, and I cannot become like them completely. I'm what I am, they are what they are, I can learn from them. So one of the ways to finish this is to overcome your inferiority complex. Try to be proud of what you have. Don't think that whatever you copy from the others, the major powers, must be necessarily good to you. They are not necessarily good to you, but to understand that, you have to understand who you are first. And the other problem, which is also a mirror of the same problem, is the political instability and division that I mentioned in the other interview last week too, is that you have a lot of problem like this over here. In fact, you have the same problem like that in Africa too.
I think what you just mentioned about the lack of this understanding who you are and all, this is the basis for this instability and political instability, because we want to copy from, and people, it comes to where people manipulate political parties or individual leaders, and they think the way they, this inferiority that we have, we think what they advise us is the way to go, and then advise the other one, the other group being advised by others, so we are divided, and then the instability comes in. But I think what you mentioned here, you have to know who you are first.
Yeah, maybe I can go a bit more concrete in the proposal, because that can be more useful for people to understand. I do think that in the future, the government may need to introduce some specific legislations or programs which will do something like this. Let me give you some example. Number one, over here, how do you say that, Vanuatu, when they see a foreigner, especially from the former colonial powers or external powers, they call them, hi boss, yes master. That is a habit of talking. I understand that. But that way of talking is not good for development. You help yourself to perpetuate a sense of inferiority openly. So one of the things that the government can do is to teach the local people that when you talk like this, you hurt yourself psychologically and mentally, and that's counter-destructive, productive in terms of development. That's one example. Another example is about political division. I also think that it's also high time for Vanuatu to really work together as a political force, as a country together, not that my party versus your party, my community versus your community, my group versus your group. This country is too divided politically. There are so many transitions of governments. And in a way, the political system that you borrow from the West is hurting you too, by the way. So you need to find out some way to understand who you are, what you need, without copying. You need to liberate yourself from all this colonial legacy, which has been imposed on you, and you are doing that too.
Yes.
And I can go even further. Look about the religion that you have. Look at the language that you have. All this, and the banking, and the law about migration and all that. Look at all these laborers that you send to Australia and other people. How much do they pay you? And year in, year out, how does it benefit your own community? You are still enslaved in that sense. You are not free from any of this. So you can talk about it, of course. I'm sure that the local people know about this, because that's what they told me too in person when I interviewed them. So it's not that I do not know about it. They know more than I do about it. So how come you know more than I do about it, and yet you don't do anything about it? Talking is easy. It's very cheap. Achievement is expensive, but it's hardworking. It requires a lot of work. Why do you keep doing what you are doing, given the fact that you know more than I do? Your people even told me all of these problems, but then I had to come on the radio to tell you and ask you, why are you not changing it?
Yes.
And why do you have so many examples to tell me? And at the end of the day, you are are doing.
And I do believe, Professor, that it will take time. It won't happen overnight.
True, but patience also has a limit.
Yes.
True patience, by the way, is also an excuse of laziness and underdevelopment.
And the realization of this has emerged after 40 years.
And this is called political inertia.
Yeah.
And that is the political predicament that you have to overcome.
I think we have bypassed, I mean, being a Christian country, we compare ourselves to the walk of the Israelis, the Jewish population from Egypt to the so-called promised land. It took them 40 years. So now we have crossed to the 40-year lifespan in the country, and people start to realize. And now we're discussing what we're discussing now. Say, hang on, what did we do the last 40 years? What happened? What have we achieved? And this is where I said earlier on that we need to have some serious thinkers, like what the systems that I learned that the system that runs the world today was thought through by some scholars or some people who think. For example, the democracy was developed by Socrates and all these people in the Greek philosophers.
No, that's not quite true. By the way, there's a Western interpretation of the history of democracy.
Well, anyway, but that's what I'm saying. It's Western. It's from a foreign country. Whoever came up with it, it's not a homegrown idea, but it's running the world today, the so-called democratic world, democracy. So for us, we need people. My point is, we need people who can think about life, who think about what we have, who think about what we have done. Like you mentioned about this slavery in Australia and New Zealand. We need to think about these realities. You don't realize the other side of the coin until you see the other side of the coin.
And that's why I have been telling you all these concrete examples from your side,
Yes.
so that you can relate to what I'm saying in a very daily life.
Yes.
Yesterday was Sunday. That was the day that a lot of people went to church. I think people here spend too much time in the church or doing all this kind of religious activities. If you were to spend all your money, time, and energy working on development, you can overcome a lot of problems. Instead of spending so much time on religion, in this case on Christian religion, it's the same problem in Africa. That's even worse. In some African countries, they don't even have one day on Sunday. Almost every day the church is open, and people go to the church almost every single day, and they have fun over there. Look, this is getting too much. So I think that maybe you also need to look into the urgency of development that you are asking me, but there is word only, rhetoric only. In reality, your daily life is not driven to do that. All this is just a soundbite. It sounds very nice, but at the end of the day, at the end of this radio conversation or interview, things life will go back to normal.
Yeah. Well, Professor, before we take a commercial break, I just want to say what you just said. You're speaking the record in Genesis chapter 1. God did not create people to go to church. He created people to look after, to work. And that's exactly the message that you've just given us today. So I'd like to thank you for that one, for reminding us. Well, anyway, I have someone on the phone who always calls me on the phone, and maybe he has a comment or a question to give us. Good afternoon, Nangel. Welcome to the show.
Yes, good afternoon.
Yes, line is on. Thank you.
Okay, thank you for the opportunity. But maybe I'll contribute in a way that I understand how look. And you know, walk out and then maybe look down at something. And whenever we're talking, you use the opponent, it's true. When it's in the church, there must be 10%. Go let me ask you 10%. But continue giving more than 10%. Why? For us, then, but you give them money, well.
Following me, capital FM 107, I mean, very, very interesting. Suppose you start listening, come, Dr. Peter, Mr. Lupesia, Peter Baofu, I mean, talk about life and he talk about observation of the hand of Vanuatu. You wake him up, you can back think, we did story last time. We need people who can think through, who can think. Don't just sit back and then accept everything where it's come. But you must learn. I mean, you pick from one country, so let's make it. Or development, for example, like the geopolitical issues going on, one country or against and the other. But you know, Doctor, we are members of the non-aligned movement, right? We understand some of our neighbors, some of our countries that we have diplomatic relations with, have issues with each other. For example, China and the West. But we are friends with both. And how can we use this as a stepping stone to develop Vanuatu?
First of all, you are not allowed to have friends with both. That's not true internationally. In global politics, that is a rivalry.
Well, maybe I'll say we don't throw ourselves into agreeing to one against the other.
Yes.
Let them have their own conflicts, but we
Yes, but remember, Vanuatu is not a superpower. You have outside powers, they are many times more powerful than you are.
Yeah.
So you can talk as much as you like about non-alignment, but at the end of the day, there's not much that you can do to be independent. That's one of the reasons, by the way, that many small countries on earth, many of them are not really independent. Even for a country like Japan, which is a major economic power, Japan is dependent on the US. Since 1945, in fact, the national security of Japan is still dependent on the US. Japan does not have an independent foreign policy. In fact, Japan, West Germany at that time, was used to be called by some of the national security advisors of the American presidency as a vassal. We think of them as a vassal. They do what we tell them to do. That's why every time when the US says something about foreign policy, Japan has to follow. Have you ever seen, since 1945, Japan has ever done anything which openly disagree with the US on foreign policy? At the end, whether they can shout and yell, they have to obey. So even for a major economic power like that, can you imagine Vanuatu can do more? So I'm trying to say is that yes, we have the non-alignment movement. This sounds very beautiful, it sounds very wonderful, but we're realistic. In reality, you don't have much. Look at Solomon Islands. They signed the security pact with Australia and have been in good terms with the US. Now they just signed a security pact with China. Look at how much pressure that they have been receiving since then, or even before that. You see that?
Yeah,
and it's quite a number of other Pacific Islanders, they have been under tremendous pressure ever since.
Well, the way you're putting it is like there's no hope.
No, there is hope, but I'm trying to put you in a very realistic light.
Yes, we understand that.
Yeah.
But we want to have the hope. Where is the hope?
See, the hope is that the people have to understand this. Because if the people have the false illusion, government policy is very difficult to be implemented in the long term. You need the people to understand the government policy and to support it.
Yes.
And once the people understand that how much tremendous pressure that you have been under, they tend to support the government, then the government is much more united. That's why I said Vanuatu, just like in many other cases, have political instability, is very divided. And people from the outside will take advantage of you.
Yes.
And that's called divide and conquer. In fact, it's exactly what Israel has been doing to the Palestinians. Israel has been doing everything it could to divide the Palestinians, especially between the Fatah and the Hamas. That's exactly what the Palestinians have been fighting against each other. This can help Israel more than anything else.
Okay, I'm just looking at our time now, Professor. I understand that you have been visiting various places in various sectors of life here on Efate Island, and you've been talking to farmers, and especially in relation to climate change. If you can just touch on what you learned, and then you run off your talk on what you see is way forward for Vanuatu.
Climate change is another interesting topic. It has affected many countries on Earth. But in the case of Vanuatu, based on the conversation that I had with some farmers, and also I visited some farmland, and I can see that climate change has some effect. Some products cannot be produced much anymore because the climate is getting too hot. And some of the products now you can get them more easily because they are hotter. So now, but I think that is more a question of how to adjust the agricultural production in order to benefit from climate change. Climate change by itself is not necessarily good, it's not necessarily bad. Again, just like anything in life, the challenge is how are you going to cope with that, and how are you going to deal with that. And that's the same thing I mentioned about the Second Cold War that I predicted between the China and the US. It's not necessarily good for you in Vanuatu, but it depends on how are you going to cope with that. If you cope with that successfully, I think that is a long-term benefit, but if not, then you will suffer from it. Instead of just being a crybaby and just saying climate change, that is not, of course, a good
No, thank you very much, Professor, for coming to our program. It's called Vanuatu Today. It's current affairs, and what you've shared with us here is so important to wake people up, to think for themselves, and to also learn from those around us, and building bridges rather than burning bridges, and that's in the name of humanity. Humanity, we talk about mutual respect and mutual understanding each other's, cultures and values, and I think we have learned that life is complex. Life is not, you cannot build a one-way thinking or mindset, but you have to understand life is a different perspective and views and ideas, but understanding life, but the power of understanding, I think, is important.
The beginning.
It is
the beginning, but you have to achieve it. You have to implement that too.
Yes. And I thank you because we've come to our time now, and I have to say goodbye to those of us listening out there, and to you, and all the best to your trip, to you on your trip around the world, in spreading the word, encouraging people to stand up and believe in themselves and do something better for themselves and humanity.